What's up, guys? Jay Martin here, investor and CEO of Cambridge House. And my guest today is Paul Sankey. He is the lead analyst at Sankey Research. He's an energy analyst, world-renowned, regular on most mainstream media platforms, and a bit of a legend on Wall Street. Now, this was a super interesting discussion. I approached this using Paul as my expert to discuss the geopolitical implications that will spin out of Russia's war on the Ukraine, compartmentalizing the world really into like three main players, asking the questions: how is Europe going to survive this? How is the US going to adapt to this? And how is China going to capitalize on what's occurring right now in the Ukraine? And with Paul's help, I got to some interesting outcomes. So I'm looking forward to sharing this with you. Now, three things before we jump into this interview. Number one, I publish a weekly newsletter and I love writing it. There's a pinned comment right beneath this video where you can subscribe. It's free and I love writing it. So I'd love to have you join the team. We've got about 50,000 people that tune in weekly and love to have you there. Number two, the ad revenue from this channel is donated to an organization super close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Their mission is to end youth homelessness and they do a very good job. And number three, if you prefer to listen to my content as opposed to watch it, you can find me wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for The Jay Martin Show. Here's Paul Sankey. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, what's up, guys? Jay Martin here, investor and host of The Jay Martin Show. I'm joined right now by Paul Sankey, the lead analyst at Sankey Research. Paul, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on.
How are you?
What's that?
How are you? Everything
I'm
seems
excellent.
fine.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm excited to talk to you and unpack a bunch of concepts that I'm trying to understand better. We're talking about the energy market. And, what I try to do with these interviews, Paul, is sit down with experts who understand a concept better than I do to help me determine what's actually worth paying attention to, right? Like, we're bombarded with sensational headlines every day, now more than ever. And so today I want to run through what you're paying attention to on the energy landscape. And I try to compartmentalize this a little bit if I can. So, if we're looking at the energy industry right now, maybe let's look at China as a player and the various dynamics going on there, Europe as a player, same thing, and then the US. But I'll hand it over to you first. What are you paying the most attention to right now in the energy space?
Well, the key thing is always demand, right? And that's underanalyzed. And it's difficult to analyze because a lot of it is about the economy. And so, you very quickly get sucked into, sort of the Fed and stuff and all sorts of permutations on what's going on economically. The Chinese actually keep it quite simple because they just, have yesterday put out a new raised target for GDP, and you kind of figure they're going to get there. And it's not as if they give you, tons of data, and if they did, it would probably be a lie. So there's not that much to analyze, weirdly enough, with China, even though, we would love to, but it's just not that much that can be done. And it's quite convenient what you said, because essentially the world oil market on the demand side is about a third Asia, about a third Europe, Middle East and Africa, and about a third Americas. So you've got a 100 million barrel a day oil market. It's a lot of oil, 1,200 barrels a second. And the barrel is what you imagine a barrel is. That is to say, it's a pretty big amount of oil. So you've got about a third of the 100 million in those three regional buckets. And if you can get the demand side right over time, you're going to be right on oil. And my joke is always that my job as an oil analyst doing equities on Wall Street is easy. All I've got to do is get the oil price right. That actually became a bit of a stale joke because at times over the last 10 years, the oil equities have actually disconnected from oil, the commodity, which would be, for your sophisticated viewers, would be multiple degradation. And, there's various reasons why that can happen, but it did. And now you may have multiple expansion. It's very difficult to tell because there's so much noise. And then on the supply side, obviously, that's where where oil analysts tend to talk. Essentially, there are, you could argue, four major producers. And by the way, the list of producers is quite small. There's not that many places that produce a load of oil. But the three giants are Saudi, obviously, Russia, and the US. And you could add Canada into the US if you want to think about it geopolitically.
Yeah,
they produce large quantities of oil. With Russia, you have Russia pretty much, and the interest there tends to be between supplying Europe and supplying China and Asia. And then in the Middle East, it gets a bit more complicated. But basically, you have Saudi that tends to work in close cooperation and actually blood ties with the UAE, United Arab Emirates, who produce about around 3 or 4 million barrels a day. Saudi, Russia, US all do about 10, 12 million barrels a day out of the 100. Right. So that's obviously 36 million barrels right there a day. And then the other really, this is where it gets complicated in terms of geopolitics, and perhaps not at the moment, is that you have Iran and Iraq, who are both, very volatile at times, but are both where the oil is Shia Muslims as opposed to Sunni Muslims. And the Shia oil, which would be Iran and Iraq combined, would be a supergiant, would be another 8 million or so. Potentially, if they got their sanctions right, could be easily as big as the other three. But essentially, obviously, is split between Iran, currently under sanctions, and then Iraq, currently the Wild West.
Right.
And after that, the list actually kind of tails off. There's a whole load of other guys, North Africa. We read about Libya a lot, and other places with huge potential, which are just disaster areas, partly because of what we call the curse of oil, which I can explain. But the curse of oil would be applied to Venezuela, for example, which easily could produce 10, 12 million barrels a day if you had Texans running it.
Right.
But unfortunately, because of, a long story, which I can tell if you've got an hour, Venezuela is a total, complete and utter tragedy and disaster area all at the same time. But that's kind of the big dynamics. And you want to think about demand and how you think oil demand's going, which is why obviously then you get into Tesla, how behavior is changing.
Right.
In terms of how much oil we're using, and on the supply side, whether or not Russia's going to invade Ukraine or not.
Yes.
It's an interesting job.
Yeah, no kidding. There's so much in there that I want to pull on. So I'm going to try to be specific here. So this week, and keep in mind, we're recording on March 9th for anybody watching this. We're probably going to publish this one as soon as possible. But, Biden's big announcement, he's banning Russian oil imports. And, I don't know if that's just really lip service at this point. It's just a public announcement because the corporations have already stopped importing. So it doesn't really matter. But I guess my question there is, that's US and the UK at this point who have made that announcement. Do you expect, and is it possible for Europe to follow suit and be the next domino, or are they too reliant? Like, could they do that?
They can't really do it. I mean, they are just simply too dependent, and they kind of screwed it all up, needless to say. If you wanted to be really cynical, you would say you don't want a 17-year-old making your energy policy, but actually there's a genuine continent-wide concern about the environment and a willingness, basically because you would say Europe is less of a consumption-led society. There's more sort of moral concern at a given level about the environment. And it's also a consensus concern that, there really is a major problem that needs to be addressed.
Right.
And so, as a result of that, they've overcooked the extent to which they've tried to, essentially in their electricity systems, they've gone very dependent on wind, particularly in the UK and Germany, all the while shutting down the biggest gas field in Europe, which was in Holland, called Groningen, which used to be what we call the swing supplier of gas, because you have tremendous swings in demand for gas in Europe during winter. And then at the same time as shutting down Groningen, they shut down the biggest storage facility in the UK. 70% of their gas storage was shut down, which was boneheaded. In 2016, the Rough storage facility. What you do is you pump gas into depleted gas fields and then pump it out again when you need it. They shut that, which was like, I don't think you should do that. And then the German Green Party was actually originally back in the 70s anti-nuclear. That was the big concern, was really around things like 3 Mile Island, the big US nuclear disaster. Yeah, that we don't want nuclear power. And so weirdly, because of course you get into whether or not nuclear power is dangerous, and whether or not it's friendly for emissions relative to any other energy. And they're on the dangerous nuclear power track. And so they shut down, they're kind of still in the process, in theory, of shutting down all their nuclear baseload. So you need to know a little bit about electricity generation in all of this. Electricity cannot be stored. There's a couple of minor ways you can do it, but batteries are not of the scale yet to really make any difference. So when you flick on a light, that electricity has to be available. And everybody flicks on the lights generally at night when there's no solar. Wind tends to correlate. So basically it's either windy everywhere or it's not, and it tends to run. So basically if it's not windy, it tends to be not windy for 2, 3, 4 days, or windy for 2, 3, 4 days. I think everyone intuitively knows this. And there's no battery that can make up for that. So essentially you need a base load power. You need something running all the time, which nuclear is ideal for. And then you need peaking when you need peaking when there's no wind and sun, and gas, nat gas is ideal for that. The problem is someone along the line got nat gas lumped in with coal as bad for the environment and called it fossil fuels.
Right.
And that's the overstep. And you know what, Jay? I forgot the question. What was the question?
Well, hold on. I want to pull on that. I mean,
I'm boring myself to tears here. I hope the viewers are okay.
No. Well, you hit on an important point. You're right. You know, when we talk about fossil fuels, we lump things like coal and natural gas into that bucket, which perform very, very differently. You know, I guess back to, I asked about Europe and the likelihood that they could ban Russian oil imports the way that the UK and the US has.
Yeah, I remembered the question. Yeah.
And it seems unlikely because there's certain countries like Italy how much of Italy's oil comes from Russia? Is it?
It's a lot. They're not that oil. They're not as oily as the US, right? So we use about 20 barrels of oil per head per year here, believe it or not. Europe uses about 10.
Okay.
China uses about 2 or 3, and India uses 1. So each person uses 1 in India, 20 in the US, and 10 in Europe. And as you know, actually, it's partly because of the roads in Europe. You know, they're kind of built for horses, so you can't drive an Escalade in Europe. It just doesn't. I mean, you can drive them on the freeways, but you can't park them in the town.
Yeah.
So there's a much more efficient use of oil there. But the thing about oil is it has something that we call a convenience premium, which is that where you're sitting, if you decided to burn energy now, you could go in the garden and get some wood and start a bonfire. You could go to the gas station, but you could go to the deli and get some lighter fuel, and that would be oil. That's effectively oil that you could then burn on the spot. And I guess you could kind of, in theory, find some coal. I don't know where you would buy it, or charcoal. So those are your immediate options if you think about it. And, you know, 2 of them are obviously pretty clumsy, charcoal and wood. But the oil is actually pretty energy dense, and you could probably sensibly light your house in a crisis using an oil-fired lamp, believe it or not.
Right.
But with natural gas, you know, I don't know about your specific local permitting, but natural gas, it might take it might be physically impossible ever to get natural gas into your house, right? Because it might be against the law now, believe it or not, which is, again, incredibly stupid where they ban natural gas linkages, because natural gas is really good for cooking and for heating. It's very efficient. So you should be using it. It's also, you know, compared to what's happening in China, it's just not that damaging for the environment. And that's where the global environmental agenda is just a total, you know, shambles, because you've got India and China burning all this coal. And then in Berkeley, California, you can't use, you know, gas in your home to cook with a wok. It totally doesn't make any sense. But anyway, the long and short of it is that you have a convenience premium for oil, which means that it's very replaceable when you think about it at a high level. So basically, it's what we call fungible. So if you can't buy oil from Russia, you can go and buy it from Libya, you know, because the system is actually quite flexible in terms of your ability to move the stuff around. By the same token, the gas supply is very fixed. So, you know, if Russian gas gets cut off to Germany, if Russian gas gets cut off to Italy, you don't have any gas, especially not in Germany, because they don't have any, idiotically, quite frankly, they don't have any regas terminals. So regas is when you bring in liquid natural gas, which is super chilled natural gas, you know, from Qatar, Trinidad, US. You can then, that's obviously gives you that flexibility when you need the extra gas, you can bring it into the country. Everywhere in Europe has tons of regas terminals, including Italy. But not Germany. So they completely blew this one.
Would that be why Germany was the most hesitant to impose sanctions on Russia? They were the last country standing when it came to banning Russia from SWIFT. Would that be why?
Yep.
Yeah, that's why. Interesting. So then that puts the leverage back in the hands of the Russians, I suppose, because if Europe can't abstain from Russian gas, maybe Russia, and there's now, correct me if I've got this Incorrect, but China is now discussing a new gas deal with Gazprom, right, to purchase additional gas from Russia. Could Russia find a new customer for the gas that's currently selling to Europe?
Yeah, the Chinese will take everything you can get, but you have to build monster pipelines, right? Because it's an awful long way. Because the gas essentially comes from the Arctic, kind of think about sort of north of St. Petersburg or something.
Okay.
And then from the Urals, which is what we call you'll now probably know the name of the Russian crude grade is Urals. So that's the Ural Mountains, which is all in the middle. And it's just a long way if you think about, the map. So again, you can't just flick the switch on this, but long term, China needs all the gas it can get, basically because the amount of coal that the Chinese are burning is killing the population. So they have horrific emphysema problems and stuff.
Right.
And you really don't want to be burning as much coal as they are. So, one of my key lines about the environment is the problem is global, but the solutions are local. And that's why you get really dumb things in North America. Like there's a Mountain Valley pipeline here, which would take Marcellus gas, which we literally call the Saudi Arabia of natural gas around Pennsylvania. There was recently, for example, it's insane that in New England, you burn Qatari gas from Qatar, and you don't burn Marcellus, basically, because they won't allow pipelines to be built because they're being environmentally friendly. It's just boneheaded, it's incredible. Mm. And by the same token, there was a gas pipeline going south called the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP, which recently was blocked by a federal judge, 96% complete, and $6 billion sunk in the ground. And the judge said, we can't let it cross the Appalachian Trail. And, you got to remember these things are safe and they cross underground. You know what I mean? It's not an eyesore, it's buried.
Yeah.
So the idea that these things are dangerous is really kind of dumb. It really is basically dumb. Additionally, the existing pipeline infrastructure is old in the US, so you should really be replacing it all. And finally, they won't build a grid because nobody wants the power lines. So, the whole thing's a terrible mess. But yeah, China will take what Russia can give. But don't get it wrong. In the short term, a couple of things happen. Number one, the oil industry dropped Russian oil like a bad habit, actually for financial reasons. Because when you buy oil, these tankers are real big. You probably haven't seen one. They take 2 million barrels. It's not unusual to have a 2 million barrel tanker. That is an enormous ship. And if you put 2 million barrels on it, you've got at $100 a barrel, you've got $200 million of oil. You don't just fill up and, flick the guy a credit card. You need a letter of credit. You need a line of credit. You need insurance. You need insurance for the cargo. You need insurance for the ship. And when they put these sanctions on Russia, that whole chain just broke down immediately, and Russian oil just was dropped like almost immediately. And that was, frankly, to me, I shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but it was just how fast the system just went.
Right.
And BP that wanted to get out of Russia added to it because they used the excuse of the attack to get the hell out of Russia finally without, so they could do a write down and their shareholders would go, yeah, I get it.
Yes.
And as soon as BP left, then all the other companies had to do the same. So there was an incredible effect of these financial sanctions on the oil industry. For the gas industry, as you know, actually we started using more Russian gas, and incredibly a lot of it coming through Ukraine, basically because the financial system kept working and the assets are fixed. So as you say, there's nothing really they could do.
Right. And that's why I guess when I heard Biden's announcement, it was kind of like, yeah, I get it, but this has already happened, right? From the corporation standpoint. You said...
Yeah, the problem with the Biden administration is that they were so keen to present green credentials, basically because the environment polls very well with young people.
Sure,
and it polls very well with Democrats, and I believe it polls well with women. I'd have to check that. But essentially, young people, are worried about the environment, needless to say, and they thought, they just wanted to hammer an environmental message, even though a lot of it is just BS hypocrisy, which I hope, your listeners will work to better understand what we call energy density, which is basically that this much oil can drive a Hummer for 2 miles. It would take a significant amount of time of uninterrupted solar power to generate the same electricity. So you can't just say, okay, let's switch to solar. It doesn't make any sense. It's interruptible.
Right.
And it doesn't have the energy. It's very simple. It doesn't have the energy density of oil.
Yes.
And therefore replacing it's very difficult. But yeah, so basically the administration came to power. They wanted to be environmentally friendly. They didn't want to hire anyone with oil in their history. So they really don't know anything about oil. And look where it ended up. It ended up pretty badly,
Right. Okay. So on the on the China front, that's just a deepening relationship. This new pipeline, if it can get built from Russia to China, would have to go through Mongolia. It's not a near-term solution, obviously, but I guess it's on trend. I think China's invested $60 billion in Russian gas infrastructure in the last 5 years. If I've got that right, somewhere around there.
I wrote about Russia in early January, and you can get the note on my website. But the numbers, it depends how you start counting it, because basically there's already a lot of existing infrastructure that's being built. There's huge pipelines already.
Yes.
But what's been really staggering is just the scale of China's energy use and the growth of China's energy use. And I'll give you an example, which is just enormous. Last year, Chinese electricity demand grew 12%. Okay, it was a lot.
Demand grew
12%. Chinese electricity demand with 1.4, whatever it is, billion people is bigger than US and Europe combined.
Right.
So when China grows 12%, you add Japan. Now, I know what Japan looks like if you think about Japan at night. It's pretty lit up.
Right.
And it's 100 million people. Every year China's adding Japan. So when you say, did they spend 60 billion? It's like, dude, you'd have to go back through a whole load of stuff to work out how much they spent, but they have to spend a lot. China has more coal-fired plants under construction than we have coal-fired plants.
Right.
I think
so China's, they're laughing then because, they need everything Russia can sell them. It's in their best interest that the UK, that Europe eventually bans Russian gas so they can buy it, maybe even on the cheap, right? This is a Wall Street controversy. How much did China want this to happen? Right.
Why did Putin wait for the end of the Winter Olympics? All this stuff. What the hell is going on here? Are we looking at a new world order where the Chinese just try and grow their economy domestically?
Sure.
Don't care about the rest of the world. These are all mega questions. What's the value of money now that you just took all the money off the Central Bank of Russia? All of these things and more, my friend.
Yes. Okay. And this might be too esoteric. Could there be some retribution here thinking about, land that Russia more or less took from China near the end of the Opium Wars? China can now make its comeback. You look at
that again goes complicated. I think the general view, to keep it simple, is would China use Russia and Ukraine to invade Taiwan, which is kind of the big one. And just to add to the excitement, Taiwan had a major power cut at like peak Ukraine fear. So everyone was like, including me, was like, whoops, here we go. But actually it was just generally some dude flicked the wrong switch in the Taiwanese power generation, thankfully. But generally, I think the Chinese are about the Chinese, right? And so they're just trying to, actually, really, the Chinese are about the Communist Party. Chinese power is about maintaining power for the Communist Party in a kind of complete Big Brother totalitarian way. I would hate to live there. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's just a nightmare kind of thing. And so they're just totally acting in what they perceive to be the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, which is basically to control everyone, get them all moving in one direction. And, they need energy. I don't know where to start and end with China, but basically they act totally in their own interests. Specific stuff around the edges tends to be that they'll fight for Nepal, for example. They'll beat up the Uyghur Muslims and put them in concentration camps. All that stuff is about protecting the core of China, right? South China Sea. It's not about trying to invade Australia. It's about making sure no one gets close to the core of China.
Right. Okay. So I think I understand that clearly. And to me, I see a logical sequence of events, whether it's the last, at least half decade of investment in Russian gas infrastructure, new deals on the table, but all this plays to the favor of China, it seems to anyways. We talked about Europe. I want to talk about the US because Russian gas, it's maybe what is it? Or Russian oil is at 10% of US consumption?
It bounces around, actually. I mentioned to you how much each tanker carries. So it literally kind of depends whether a 2 million barrel tanker arrives or not, because on that day, obviously it would be 2 million barrels a day, and then there won't be any tankers for a while. But I can tell you that, I cover Valero and these guys, and I know them well, and they've stopped buying Russian oil. So it depends on how you count it. But I spoke to the State Department on off the record, but on the record, because it's a fact, the number they were using was 800,000 barrels a day of Russian imports. That sounds high to me, but anyway, let's say it is 800 a day normalized, which is say pre-Ukraine. That would be out of 20 million total demand.
Yes.
And actually, at times, that would be a lot of what we import.
Okay.
Yeah, but then again, Canada is 4 million barrels a day. So, the real big supplier that we have that most people kind of don't know is that Canada is by far our biggest source of imports.
Right.
God bless the Canadians.
Yes. God bless the Canadians. I love it. All right. Well, either way, the US has to refill that supply, right? And what are the options on the table, I guess, Paul? I know that President Biden apparently is talking to Venezuela about restarting that industry. To your point, maybe 30 years ago, it was a mega producer and could be again, but that's going to take a lot of time and money. Canada's right next door to the north. But what else? I mean, you mentioned Iran. You mentioned.
Well, we could drill more. I mean, obviously, I think where you're heading here is do we drill more in the US? And that's a big question for Wall Street, because people are saying, I blame Wall Street for the oil companies not drilling more. And, it's sort of just a moronic thing to say because, what is Wall Street? How are you going to define Wall Street? I always call myself a Wall Street analyst, but I worked at Deutsche Bank on Wall Street. Literally, so I could claim to be a Wall Street analyst because my address was 60 Wall Street. By the way, if you watch The Big Short, I always joke there's an extra in that movie playing me, because I used to sit on the morning call with the Ryan Gosling guy yelling about the property market while I was yelling about oil. But anyway, we could drill more here. We can buy more from Venezuela, but it's suboptimal, because they're kind of a disaster area, those guys. They're really not treating the people of Venezuela right, and we shouldn't be supporting these guys. And by the way, the same applies to the Iranians. I mean, these mad mullahs, they should be out of business, man. They're not good people in terms of the political structure. They're not democracies, and all the rest of it. And nor, for that matter, is Russia. So that's the problem with our oil use in a lot of ways. And, it's a bit like how you deal with your environmental footprint. If you're worried about the environment, you should try and go net zero, try and see if you can become net zero. It's theoretically possible. You're going to have to plant a load of trees on every year or use a lot less energy. Mm-hmm. Like you're going to have to give up your private plane, dude. But, and that's what, by the way, pisses me off about John Kerry. It's like this guy's flying around in a private plane. And it's a little bit the same with Leonardo. It's like, okay, so you get to hang out on the massive yacht with loads of supermodels, but I've got to, what do I have to do, in order to stop your environmental footprint? It's absolute hypocrisy of the worst kind. And by the way, the same applies to Greta. She's a Swedish schoolgirl that's been brought up in one of the richest, most advanced countries in the world, thanks to fossil fuels. And now she's turning around and saying, stop you Indians, stop you horrible Chinese people from using so much energy. It's like, shut up. Right. So there's a major problem with the amount of energy we use relative to what it's doing to the environment. But these people who preach at me about it, they can all go and get lost. Right. But the big one would definitely be that we would produce more here, Jay, because we can actually, if the companies plan on higher prices. And the problem that a Wall Street analyst will tell you, like me, is, okay, so what's your price? What do you think the price is going to be? And would you guarantee it for me? Because, why would I risk my money just to make you feel better about not using Russian oil? Because that's what you're asking them to do. I'm a shareholder in, let's say I'm a shareholder in Pioneer or Devon or one of the great US E&Ps. Why would I have to put my money up to save President Biden's skin after all he's done, against the oil industry, all the rhetoric against the oil industry when the oil price was freaking negative 2 years ago? I didn't hear them trying to save the oil industry then. And now you need it. And you're like, why aren't you up producing more oil? And I say, I'll tell you why I'm not producing more oil, because 2 years ago, the oil price was negative. Jay, in November, the oil price was 60.
That's right.
You know what I mean? It's like, come on, man. What do you want if I'm doing an annual planning assumption? What shall I use? And can you guarantee I'll get that price in a year's time?
And nobody can.
Nope.
Not a chance.
Because as we started, the demand side reacts. Demand might just go away in a rush. We could get another COVID, man. We could go back to negative in 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm going to look like a bit of a muppet when I, have dropped an extra two. And by the way, the amount of money you have to spend is not, it's not peanuts. It's like, okay, I'm going to write a check for $100 million so that President Biden feels better about the fact that he messed up the oil policy.
Right. Yes. Now, what is this? What's your outlook, I suppose, Paul, for these consumer implications? Right, we're talking about short-term, price at the pump, et cetera. What's the average right now? Is it about $5 per gallon? Is that high? Are we headed there?
Yeah, you should be. I mean, the difference across the U.S. is
California pays a lot more, but yeah.
Yeah, it just depends on the tax by state. The price of gasoline, actually, talking about, as I was, the fungibility of oil, the fact that it's kind of oil everywhere. The gasoline price is actually global on an underlying basis. I'm just looking at the oil price here for you. And it's really the difference is tax. So in the UK, for example, they pay right now, they're paying like $12 a gallon, but they normally pay $8. And that's a function. That's just entirely a function of tax, literally. My spreadsheet's not working. And here, as you know, the difference is California has high tax, New York has high tax, and Texas really doesn't, or whatever. So that's the difference. It's not in reality. It's more in reality about sticker shock, that people see the price and they pay cash. And they're like, oh my God, last week I was paying $3 and now I'm paying $4 a gallon, and it's $70, $80, $90, $100. It's not actually at a US level that much money. People will pay $100, for a meal out. I don't know what. But it obviously is, the major concern is it's regressive, which is to say it hurts poor people hugely. That might be a day's wages for a minimum wage person. And, for Jay with the private jet, what do you care, when you fill your Bugatti? But
right.
The fact is, that's the concern, is that what we're in here is a rich get richer, poor get poorer tape in general. And then you add, something really regressive like high energy prices, and people don't have a choice. They have to drive to work, they have to heat their home, and they get crushed by it. And so that's the concern, I'm afraid to say. And it is a concern. And, by the way, there's a lot of nasty things about this Ukrainian situation, needless to say, but the price of wheat is really bad. That's like going to be famine in Egypt type stuff, and that's not figurative. That's Egypt is one of the biggest buyers of Ukrainian wheat, and they're really not very rich. So yeah, it's a major problem and a major concern.
Now, so given what you shared, a lot of this is non-negotiable, our demand for oil, but, so then do you figure the prices could eventually get to a point that are creating demand destruction at home? Is that a significant
number?
I'm
sure people now, even rich people, and, you don't seem to be responding very, very well to my Bugatti jokes, Jay, but anyway, it's just, maybe they're just not funny, but, sorry, I'm just trying to work this out. Sorry, what was the question? Is
rising prices, could it actually cause notable demand destruction? Or
no, that's how we look at it. Yeah, we look at how high can prices go based on what point do you destroy demand, right? That's the notional. If you think about basic supply and demand, that's obviously how it works. So basically, very low prices and you reduce supply, and you increase demand. Very high, you increase supply to reduce demand. And it works like that. It does actually work like that. It's distorted because the US is really one of the few places where you and I now could say, okay, I believe in $120 oil forever. I'm going to go down to Texas. I'm going to lease some land and I'm going to drill a well. And we could actually do that. There's actually a lot of places where you can't. For example, let's go and try and do it in Russia. I don't think so. Let's try and do it in Venezuela. Not so much. And, obviously Saudi, if you start listing off the places I listed where the oil comes from, you're left with US and Canada. We could do it in Canada. You can't do it in the UK. You can't do it in France. It's one of the key subtleties is that here you have mineral rights. So basically, you have the land ownership and you have the mineral rights ownership. And so you can buy or sell the rights to what's underneath the land. And that means that you can actually reimburse the landowner for the environmental risk of running an oil rig, which is a pretty noisy, dirty, dangerous thing on their land, and just pay them a check. It's, I'll get a bit convoluted there and I'll not continue that point, but it's really worth considering. But the point is ultimately that we could go and start an oil company here in the US, and we could reasonably be producing oil, you and me, J. Paul oil, within a year. So why not do it? That's what I would say to anyone who's saying, why doesn't the industry produce more oil? I'm like, well, you can be part of the industry as much as I can.
Right.
In fact, so the nationwide price today is 3.9 is $4.25 a gallon is nationwide retail. And then you just add $1 for New York or California. So it's going to be $5.25 New York, California. And then I think there's a gas station in Beverly Hills joking about Bugattis, which is more like 7, right? And everyone photographs that one.
Right. So given the lack of barriers to entry, it would make sense then that the US is going to fill this demand gap at home. There's no reason. I mean, Biden may go talk to Venezuela to say, oh, I tried, right? I looked at all the options, but at the end of the day, why would they do anything else except produce more at home? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's bad policy. I mean, it's emergency management, right? So you're just saying, oh my God, Americans vote against any politician that causes high gas prices. Just forget all that environmental stuff. I said, forget that the Venezuelans are, destroying their own economy with really bad kind of fascist government. Just get the gasoline price down in the US. Let's do whatever we need. Release the SPR, talk to Venezuela, give the Iranians, what I mean? It's just really bad policy. And I disapprove strongly, as you can tell. And as you're noting that it's bad for US consumers, but it's kind of not the end of the world in terms of it is a marginal choice for a lot of people to drive. So what happens is, people, and I feel bad for them, low-income people still have to kind of go to work and drive their cars. Actually, what happens at the margin is a lot of Americans start using one of the 2 cars that's more efficient. Maybe even might even have an electric car. They do less trips. They fill up a fixed amount. So you see at gas stations, people fill up $40 and then they drive very defensively. You don't do what New York cab drivers, I'm always telling them to stop doing, which is, accelerate to the lights and then brake. It uses a ton of gas. And you would think that all of that was marginal, but US gasoline demand is 10 million barrels a day. So it's 1 in 10 barrels used in the world. And with 333 million Americans, when the beauty of the American economy is the homogeneity of it. The fact that wherever you go and order a Diet Coke, you get pretty much the same service in terms of what you receive. It doesn't work like that in Europe, by the way. But the point is that when something changes in the US, it tends to be a tabletop model. That is to say, everybody changes their behavior at the same time. And we think that price is actually $4.50, Jay, further to your question.
Okay.
So we're at $4.25 right now. Now, $4.50 is guaranteed, because of the price. It takes time for the whole system, as I mentioned, to feed crude prices through to the pump. And you're going to see $4.50.
$4.50 per gallon, for sure, you're saying.
Yeah, which would be 10 in Beverly Hills.
Right. Okay.
No, it'll be at least $5.50 in California and New York.
So if I can simplify like what I think I understand so far, and I'll probably bastardize this because that's what I do. But
seem like a pretty smart guy to me, mate.
We opened up compartmentalizing into 3 main buckets: China, Europe, US. And from what I have heard you say, Europe's getting the worst deal here, right? They're pretty hamstrung right now. They don't have a lot of options, reliant on enemy resources, difficult to replace. China's probably going to be the big winner because this accelerates the trajectory they were already on of buying more gas from Russia. And now they can do so probably cheaper than they would have been able to prior to the war. And the US is going to do what they should have done anyways a long time ago, which is more domestic supply. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And then there's the Norwegians.
Let's talk about the Norwegians.
The Norwegians do great. No, Norway is just born lucky, man. They have 98% hydro, which is,
right.
Nobody has 98% hydro.
Well, I think British Columbia, the province of Canada where I live, was like 96% when I was growing up. I stand
corrected. Yeah, but I don't know how much oil and gas you produce, but Norway produces and exports a ton of oil and gas, and you're basically right. I mean, you can debate. We could debate China a lot longer because they are massively net import dependent, right? So generally, very high energy prices, oil and gas prices, not going to be good for them. But you could, exactly as you are arguing, it's reasonable to say that I think part of Putin's calculus here was that he could he could screw Europe because he had weak leadership and energy dependence. And the out would be that, exactly as you say, he would be able to sell it to China if they cut him off.
Right.
I mean, I think he totally miscalculated. And I wrote, my research on the subject was that he would take the east of Ukraine. I didn't know what he would do about Kiev, but it would be a disaster for him to try and take the West. And the risk would be that Europe would turn around and cut him off. And I think
just happened.
Well, first of all, he didn't get a quick military victory, which was a disaster. The Russian army's just completely embarrassed itself. He's totally weakened himself. They've shut the McDonald's in Russia, which is not as facile a comment as it sounds. It's the opening of the McDonald's in Russia was a big deal. So the shutting, by the same token, is too. Although I do fairly, kind of appreciate the joke that the Russians are going to be much better mental health in terms of not having, you porn. What's it called? You porn? YouTube? What's that thing? Porn, whatever's being cut off.
Yeah.
And no McDonald's, no Netflix, and no whatever the other thing was. But I get it.
Boot camp.
But no, it's actually it is bad, and it is bad domestically, and it's kind of horrible because you kind of can't protest in Russia without risking your life. So you should always thank your lucky stars and travel and look at these places and realize how difficult life is in a lot of places, to appreciate your own life.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we just got through this big freedom convoy up here in Canada that ended up making headlines around the world. Canada rarely makes headlines around the world. And obviously it was a super contentious issue here at home.
Yeah.
And
I was on Wall Street, mate. On Wall Street, we were following that. We were like, "What the hell?"
Yeah.
Since when do we have a major intellectual debate over the value of money and government overreach? Coming out of Canada, the world is really getting loopy.
Yeah, and I landed on the side of I just support civil disobedience as a blanket rule. Doesn't mean the tactics or the values, but it doesn't matter, right? It's important. It's very important. Man, I got hated on for that though. I published a newsletter where I wrote exactly that. Here's why this is important. Here's why we need to let this happen. And in my opinion, here's why this is a failure of our leadership, to be honest with you, to disengage from it completely. Yeah. But, oh man, did I get some hate for that one. Okay. So
what's that? Who are those people that are hating? Are they kind of they pro Canada? What is that argument?
Well, I think that people are very sensitive right now, and they most of us, a lot of individuals have joined a team, right? So you're on team mandate or team vaccination or team freedom or whatever, and anything that offends, a core pillar of that, you can't blend belief systems. You're this or that. And if you're not this, you must be that, which means you're against this. And it's obviously the world's not that simple, right? That's silly, but somehow we've landed in this tribalism mindset.
I mean, Canada's been, as far as the vaccine mandates and everything, it's just been completely insane. I mean, my sister's in Australia, and it's just full scale insanity. It's people have absolutely lost track of what we were trying to do in the first place, which was to flatten the curve, and it turned into just this absolute insanity. And, by the way, if you don't want to get vaccinated, good luck, man. It's fine by me. You know what I mean? It's just I don't know. People just absolutely lost their minds. And I'm like you. I'm very, I'm on the side of libertarian sort of don't be telling me what to do kind of stuff. And I was staggered by the extent that people thought that you should make kids wear masks and stuff. It was like, what the fuck?
Well, you know what? Yeah. And thankfully my oldest son is 5. I've got 3 little boys, but they're 5, 3, and 1. So we're not really in the school system, but my 5-year-old is in a completely outdoor school. We found this really alternative. It's in the forest. There's one yurt. It's like a tent for kindergarten through grade 7, but they're outside. All the lessons are outside. They're down by the river.
How's that work in the winter?
They're outside. It builds tough little Squamish kids. Yeah. We looked at this school systems and we're like, what's a core value we really want to ingratiate here, and resilience came to mind. It's how do you build resilience into a 5-year-old? Well, they got to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Let's start by just being outside in cold, wet conditions. Look, I want to dial back to your comments about this war is not going the way Putin thought it was. And, I see the same thing everybody's seeing, the Russian military is in disrepair, broken down machines, stuck in the mud, troops are under-resourced, underfed, all of this stuff, and they're not getting the wins they claimed they thought they would get. part of my mind was like, and then these sanctions maybe have been more overwhelming than Putin thought they would be. Europe unified more than he thought they would, all of this stuff. But part of my mind was like, he's a smart guy. Maybe there's been some fumbles on the battlefield, but I thought he would have had to expect every single sanction that's come his way, maybe even including SWIFT. And if that's the case, like, what else is up his sleeve? Or is this it? Do you think what we're seeing is what the game plan is? Let's just repatriate Ukraine, or is there something else underlying? What do you think?
I think it was a snowball, is a domino. You know what I mean? Hang on. It was a cascading. That's the right word. So it was a cascading series of disasters, right? So all of the things, if you do the decision tree of what can go wrong, blah, 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 it literally all went up right. You know what I mean? In terms of every single thing that could go wrong went wrong, in terms of he didn't get a quick military victory. He got really severe sanctions. He got probably more sanctions than he anticipated.
Okay.
All of those things basically went the wrong way for him. I mean, I was writing about Russia. I started writing about Germany around the time of the elections in Germany. But subsequently, when I wrote about Russia in January, 5th this year, I wrote to the clients, can you name the German chancellor, right? The only answer I got was somebody who wrote back and said, yeah, I can. He's called Vladimir Putin, right? Now people kind of know what the German chancellor's name is, right? But at that time, and also it was a coalition that included the Greens, and the way the German system works, especially with the coalition, between the election and actually getting a government together, it takes 6 months, So it's all kind of a bit of a wishy-washy mess. And of course, they're pretty, for reasons that we can probably imagine, they're pretty nervous about having a significant military. So basically, there was the weakness. Then Boris Johnson is, pretty famously some variation on a clown. And of course, Biden, the rude comment would be he doesn't know he's president.
Right.
So there was all of that suddenly coalesced, and in fact, Biden showed that he is very experienced in foreign policy. It's actually his strongest suit, even notwithstanding the Afghanistan withdrawal disaster. He's a guy that's known for his foreign policy historically. Bojo the clown basically kind of did we can't tolerate this, and he was emboldened, and as was essentially Macron, who's very unpopular in France, and Scholz just stood right up and came right at him straight away. You know what I mean? And so none of that was expected. And the list goes on. But I think particularly the fact that he didn't get a clean, quick military victory. And then it turns super cool. The first thing was that Putin had started having meetings at a table that was 40 meters long. And it was
yes,
I don't know if this guy's that well, and the Finnish president visited him. And obviously Finland has a particular interest in Russian military plans and the president. And he was he's changed. The word was he's changed. Now, we had heard 2 years ago that he's sick. And there's definitely a working theory that he's sick. And that might have caused him to make some bad miscalculations.
Right.
But then Macron has said the guy's changed, and he's gone that bit loopy with this 40-foot table. One of the theories being that he's got an autoimmune problem, which is why he has to sit at one end of a 40-foot table.
Yeah.
Call it 40 meters, 40 feet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there was all of that. That was and you wouldn't have made that stuff up in a Hollywood movie. You know what I mean? If you'd put him, it's like something from the famous Peter Sellers film about this sort of stuff, Dr. Strangelove, having him or Austin Powers, it was like an Austin Powers table that he's sitting at. But the other thing that was beyond any Hollywood script was the idea that Ukraine would have, a president that had starred, the story. And so that you couldn't have made that up. You know what I mean? And if you really look at it, these wars are fought on the internet. And so suddenly it's wow, the Ukrainian flag is an unbelievably strong brand. A lot of flags in the world, pretty much difficult. My father was a diplomat, pretty much difficult to pick out one from the other. Ukrainian flag is superb brand, right?
Sure.
And, sure enough, the president just absolutely, fulfilled what, as I said, was beyond a Hollywood script insofar as the real war is on the internet today.
Yeah.
And that's why China controls its internet. That's why Russia shut its internet, because they know that if people start reading what actually happened, the same applies to China, they're cooked. And
right.
That's what's so interesting about so much of this, is that the idea of a ground military land invasion in Europe, the first since 1945, was pretty insane.
Yes.
But then to completely and utterly get destroyed in the internet war, which they did, which is the bigger war, arguably, was also just an enormous moment in history.
Right. It's what you share there about Putin. I've been wondering because, either he's seriously ill, and I think you just probably make very different decisions when you're facing your own mortality, or, the COVID scenario that you outlined. Everybody I know, myself included, have gone through some kind of a mental health crisis in the last 2 years, just as a consequence of being isolated. Maybe if you're doing I did, I don't know, collectively ended up doing 8 weeks of quarantine. I got 3 kids, it was bananas, but I had it pretty good, right? I've got a great property. I love my kids. It's awesome. But, everybody reacted in weird ways. And I saw the best and the worst of probably everybody I know, including myself at certain points. And what you can do, how you can act in those moments is dependent on what you have access to. If you have access to Russia's military and I don't know, I just wonder what influences are in the psychology of Vladimir Putin that are motivating these decisions. And maybe it's not as simple. Maybe there's some deep rooted things there. I know
he's definitely gone loopy, and it's not as if he's surrounded by guys saying, "I think you're wrong there, Vlad." You know what I mean?
That's the thing. You create your own echo chamber, right? And then eventually you're always right.
There's no question about that. And the chat from the Pentagon is that if he's going to get killed, it's going to be the FSB. It'll be the security forces that keep him in power. And of course, the other thing is the oligarchs. If you've got a $600 million yacht, you kind of don't want to get it taken away. You know what I mean? So it's been an absolute disaster at the power structure of Russia level as well, because suddenly it's it's not like Xi and Putin aren't paranoid, right? They're paranoid.
Sure they are. So, well, the oligarchs bring up an interesting point. I was wondering that too. Do you think the CIA is infiltrating, individual oligarchs right now and saying, look, you're about to lose everything. We need a coup. We need some kind of a takeover here. Is that
yeah, but it's not like Putin hasn't thought of that. But I wouldn't be. It's very difficult with these things. Gaddafi was in charge of Libya, including U.S. bombing missions in '86, directly trying to hit his tent. The guy lived in a tent.
That's right. That's right.
And they failed. You know what I mean? They couldn't get rid of the guy. And then when it fell apart for him, the Arab Spring, the Tunisian fruit stand seller self-immolated December 2010, which was, by the way, as a function partly of very high wheat prices at the time. Keep that in mind. And then that started the Arab Spring. Gaddafi was killed by February, murdered by insurgents by February. So, you know what I mean? These things can change really fast. And you're always slightly wondering when these guys are just going to suddenly disappear from the world stage, which is eventually going to happen anyway. But, who will last the longest is always a pretty interesting. He could suddenly be gone, given what a disaster. If he was a CEO, we're not really joking about Ukraine, but, if notionally what we're saying is if he was a CEO, he would be gone, right? For this one. This one's a bad one.
Okay. Now, last question for you. You hinted or you mentioned that when I brought up maybe how involved has China been this whole time, or at least maybe influencing some of the actions that have occurred because it is in their best interest, seemingly. And you said that's a bit of a Wall Street controversy right now. Do you have any theories you could share on what's being discussed and maybe how involved China has been the whole time? Is this any threat?
Well, there was a guy, some sort of nationalist politician. You can see it online. You can see it on Twitter. And literally late December, he yelled in the Russian parliament into a microphone, "You're going to regret this on whatever the date was, February the 27th at 4 a.m. You know what I mean? He named the date of time of the invasion. So they knew they were going to invade. I thought Putin was going to make me believe he was going to invade and then not. You know what I mean? So I was always waiting for the moment where he made me believe it would actually happen, because I was saying I don't think he'd be that dumb. And it was interesting because I never got to the point where I believed it until it actually happened. So from a market triple psychology point of view, it was kind of interesting. But anyway, we know it's widely reported basically that the Chinese agreed with Putin that it wouldn't happen during the Winter Olympics. And sure enough, the Winter Olympics closing ceremony, it wasn't, a few days before they invaded.
Right.
So everybody kind of knew it was going to happen. The brilliant job that Biden did and Western intelligence was that they told everyone really loud and proud, this guy's going to invade and he's going to false flag a reason to do it. So they undermined the moral, such as it was, moral case that Putin would have in terms of public opinion to actually do the invasion, and all this stuff about, Nazis in Ukraine and stuff. And you can see the president is just a total dude. It just completely undermined the moral case for the war, which of course then caused the response to the invasion to be much sterner on the part of the Western powers, because they knew they had the moral high ground. And that means that you can make very aggressive, firm decisions when you've got very clearly the moral high ground, which they did. And so they undermined Putin from an intelligence point of view. And again, I was dissing the Western intelligence services after things like the Iraq War of 2003, where they disgraced themselves. And sure enough, there's me joking. Yeah, they're saying that the invasion is going to be on February the 29th and all this stuff. There is no February the 29th.
Yeah.
So,
but
sure
that
enough,
day did come and go, right? Like mid-February, that was what the New York Times, MSNBC was all saying. They had a date and like more or less a time. This is
and it was widely disseminated. So this is all, good hubris for the analyst, you know what I mean? Because you then learn for the next time it happens. Because by the way, my career started with Gulf War I, right? So it's not my first rodeo to go through this stuff and to second guess it in real time. Because what's fascinating about doing this on Wall Street is the market's trading as we speak, and you're trying to value the future. So you're having to put all this stuff together real fast, and you can make yourself look like a real idiot. But at the same time, if you want to make money doing this, you're going to have to do that. You know what I mean? So it's like, if you don't make a call, you can't be right, or whatever. You would think of it as Wayne Gretzky. I think he said, if you don't make a shot, you can't score. But 100%. Anyway, the reality is, China is pretty sinister, and I'm no fan of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi, at all. I can't stand the totalitarianism. My father, as I mentioned, was a British diplomat, so I'm very bitter about Hong Kong and the deal that we did notionally. You mentioned the Opium Wars. You clearly have knowledge of the deep history there. So Britain is not without blood on its hands, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But I don't really appreciate these totalitarian regimes, and I think we should do everything we can to get rid of them. So China is sinister, and what they're doing for themselves is in their own interests, and it isn't necessarily for the greater good, even of their own people. It's for the benefit of the Communist Party leadership, and I'm basically opposed to them. So where does that lead us? Well, we'll see. I mean, I think one of the conclusions of the Russian note I did in early January was they're going, China, exactly as you've been obviously doing the work yourself, China's going to use this as an opportunity to buy a lot more energy from Russia. There's also the theory that there's no limitation on China buying US, Canadian food. They're going to buy all our food as fast as possible as well. It's one of the working hedge fund theories I was talking about yesterday with some of the top hedge funds in New York. So there's a lot of stuff that you've got to watch that's going to happen here. Because, whilst we're talking about peace and the failure of the Russian invasion, as of last night, I was on CNBC saying, short oil, long tech as a trade, this has structurally changed a lot of things in the world. Probably raised the oil price on a structural basis, further to the question about reinvestment, certainly raised the value of Canadian and US oil relative to Russian, etc. You've got to think of some long-term structural things here, because good investing is about getting the themes and long-term mega themes right, and then you can trade as much as you want. But we all know, kind of, unless you're Steve Cohen, trading basically destroys value really fast. Whereas long-term investing tends to work well for Warren Buffett. So you've got to kind of derive some of the conclusions that you're deriving, and you're right to do that. And one thing I'm going to have to think about as an analyst is, okay, what are I call it writing 103 analysis. So I've got to get the 101 right, which is what actually happened here, and what happens next, which would be 102. And then 103, which is where I try and write the research, is what are the conclusions beyond 102? Do you know what I mean? So we've got to get A, the basics right, B, the derivatives right, and C, we got to get into the gamma. And that's where I try and add value, and where you can be just horrendously wrong, as you know, with gamma. So,
okay, I know I said that was my last question, but I have one more quick one. And if you got to jump, you just tell me, Paul. But can you just elaborate on the short?
I told you I've got to watch European football, dude. City are playing.
You put it on
I was at college in City. They used to be like a pub team, man. They were like a pub team. You wouldn't. Not one of the City players when I was at college in Manchester would have made the current team. Not one of them. Anyway.
I love it. I watched. I never got into football or soccer, as we call it here, except for one World Cup season, and I totally got hooked. And I was waking up at like 4 a.m. to watch games. Spain was my team, and I remember I went online and I bought a jersey of the star player that year. And I can't even remember his name, but I was so in, and I was like, Spain's got this. I go online, I order the jersey, and 45 minutes later, they lost to France and got booted out.
Yeah, the jersey is like $100, right?
The biggest bandwagon fan idiot ever.
Why do you, are you into other sports or just not into sports particularly?
Yeah, I grew up playing hockey and I played for years, but these days martial arts are my thing. I kickbox and box, and yeah, I love it.
Yeah, I sometimes go and watch the Rangers. I mean, it's great to watch live, I have to say. It's
fun.
Actually, I'm just looking at this. Man City, I forgot they won the first like 5-0. So actually, the game that we are talking about is Real Madrid against PSG. That's big. That's Real against PSG. You've got some of the great players certainly playing for PSG. Real are pretty weak right now, but we'll see what happens.
Interesting.
Anyway, sorry, what was the question?
Well, your trade idea, you said long tech, short oil, and just give me some context there. What are you doing there?
Well, no, that was just last. If you look, it's pretty funny, but I went on a run from August 2020 on CNBC Fast Money of just a ridiculous hot hand of trades, which are up like 200%. I should be I should have a Lamborghini based on what was a series of pair trades about every 3 or 4 months. But of course, I knew, and I joke during, you can see them all online, it's all on Fast Money, but basically, certainly for the first couple of times, I was like, I've got to stop doing this because I've been too right, And then last night I was just saying, finally, which, I'd called for negative oil prices in 2020, which obviously was quite a call.
Yes.
The long Exxon short Apple, which was a bad call on short Apple, but an incredible call short Exxon in 2020. Long Exxon in 2020. I rolled that into like long EOG, short Tesla, long Fang, short Fang, which was long Diamondback, short Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. All these kind of catchy things, and
yes.
All of them had a basic theme, which was the idea that if the Fed wants inflation, which was a pretty crazy thing to want, but they basically have to inflate away the debt. So they kind of have to do it.
Yes.
If they are doing that, you're going to get oil inflation, and the Fed can't control oil. And so all these trades, which sometimes I publish them, I don't like to do it too much because it's, I don't want to upset the market gods. But for example, just looking at this one, I'd forgotten, but at the beginning of this year, I said long MPC, short Rivian, and Rivian at $100 billion was quite the best short you could possibly imagine, because a lot of these crappy little companies that have no revenues don't have $100 billion market caps, you know what I mean? But this one actually had a $100 billion market cap. It was just too easy. So having said that, all of the trades were basically long oil, short tech, right?
Okay.
And last night I said, you're going to get peace. I think we're cooked out on how high the oil price can go. Trading wise, you want to be long tech, short oil. Now, I have a superstition, which is that if a trade works on the day you make it, it doesn't work. So I'm nervous because last night on TV saying short oil, long tech actually just worked so outrageously this morning. It doesn't really help my clients because they can't get the trade on it. Actually, it's almost done by the time they're going to do it. Yeah. And it's this sort of double thing, because ultimately, we're not trying to trade here. You know what I mean? We're trying to get structural positions going. So really what you want to do from here is you want to watch the weakness in oil, probably down to 100, and then buy into them. And there's a lot of good companies here. I've named a few of them. I like Diamondback a lot. I like Devon. I like Pioneer. They're all fairly obvious plays on oil, but they're also structurally increased in value basically because of what happened in Russia. And right. The oil age just isn't ending. And we said it wouldn't, which was why I could call for Exxon to be a buy in 2020, because you knew the cycle would reassert itself. And arguably what we're doing here, and guys like you getting me on podcasts, and why I accept, quite frankly, is I'm trying to educate people about the issue of energy density, about the issue of how to correctly and intelligently address the environment without destroying poor people, without increasing energy poverty, highlighting that China's, a huge part of the emissions problem. And, the plastic bag you used to go to the supermarket really isn't. All of this stuff people need to educate themselves about better. But ultimately, we're going to need more Canadian oil. So you can kind of buy any of these things on an investment basis. And, some of this stuff, whenever it gets to 20 times, 30 times EBITDA, it's very, very difficult for a company to ever justify that valuation. It's not that hard, right? And the challenge, as you know, is just that the market can stay irrational for longer than you can stay solvent. Mm-hmm. So it's, you've got to sort of do this in a very, everybody wants the kind of glamour of throwing the book around and being long, short dated puts and stuff. And I do it all the time, but I lose it all. Whenever I actually just put money into long-term structural trades, they tend to work pretty well because I've thought about it and they're measured and you average in and all these things, and I'm not here to lecture people, but the big theme is that you've probably seen peak ESG because it's kind of bullshit in terms of what people say they're doing to help the environment kind of doesn't. And the idea that oil and gas greatly damage the environment, particularly in the case of natural gas, is actually false. So, I think structurally long US natural gas, long Canadian oil, I like. Okay. And then there's maybe some names where you're still looking at significant overvaluation. One of the areas that I'm very concerned about would be EVs. There's just too many manufacturers chasing what I don't think will be a hugely successful push to get the average American to drive an electric vehicle. I think the average rich American will have two cars, one of which is electric, but I just don't see the EV replacing the Camry, and that's just because it's never going to cost $22,000 to buy an EV compared to $22,000 to buy a Camry, whatever the price is now of a Camry.
Right.
One thing just to throw in there for shits and giggles is, do you know that the price of the Camry is about the price of a Model T Ford if you price it in gold? Boom, boom, boom.
Price of a Camry equivalent to Model T Ford if priced in gold.
Yeah, it costs about as many ounces of gold to buy a Camry as it costs ounces of gold to buy a Model T Ford.
Yeah. Fascinating. All right.
And it makes sense, right?
We'll sign off with that factoid. Look, Paul, this is super fun. Thank you. All right, thank you for watching this interview. Now, 3 things before I let you go. Number 1, I publish a weekly newsletter and I love writing it. I share my biggest takeaways and action items from the conversations that I have on this channel. In addition, my thoughts on current events, economic events, political events, and you can subscribe for free. Just hit the pinned comment right beneath this video or just go to jmartin.club and you can subscribe on the website. I'd love to have you join the team. Number 2, ad revenue from this channel is donated to an organization that is super close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Now, Zero Ceiling's mission is to end youth homelessness, and the way they do this is by giving at-risk urban youth the opportunity to relocate to beautiful wilderness areas and then provide them with supportive housing, career training, and just generally positive influences on their life. I love what they do. Check them out if you're interested. And number 3, if you prefer to listen to my content as opposed to watch it, you can find me wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search for The J Martin Show. All right, thanks again.